Well, time for another edition of the Debt Matters podcast, where we help Canadians find solutions to their debt with licensed insolvency trustees from across Canada. I'm Wayne Kay, and in today's show, we're going to be discussing what steps need to be taken during bankruptcy and or consumer proposals, and what the difference is between each of them. Joining me, I've got Mark Marshall from Allan, Marshall & Associates, licensed insolvency trustee in New Brunswick, St. John office. Mark, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I'll just point out, I'm in the St. John office, but we have offices with Allan, Marshall & Associates all over Atlantic Canada, and Moncton, St. John, Fredericton. We've got some Halifax and Dartmouth and Truro, just to put a little plug in.
Terrific. So lots of options, because each little area is a little bit different, I think, when it comes to the exact specifics for bankruptcies or consumer proposals, correct?
Yeah, there's small little differences. I mean, just in regards to provincial legislation, but generally, the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act, which with bankruptcies and proposals are administered under, it's federal legislation. So most of the same rules apply across the country.
Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, well, let's jump into today. I want to find out the difference between bankruptcy and a proposal, because bankruptcies have been around for a long time. Proposals relatively new in the last 20 plus years or so. So what is the difference between the two of them?
The difference in it, it's probably easier for me to start with what's similar. So let's just start. Both of them provide protection. So both of them implement a stay of proceedings, which stops your creditors from being able to call or bug or collect. And then the difference between them is that in a bankruptcy, you're taking your assets and you're surrendering them to the trustee. So in theory, you're surrendering your assets and your liabilities to the trustee. The role of the trustee is liquidate any assets that can be liquidated, sold, and apply the funds from the sale of those assets towards the debt. Now, without scaring everybody, that there are exemptions, so you're allowed household furniture, personal belongings just up to a certain value, depending on the province. You're allowed a motor vehicle that you own outright, depending on the province as well. And then you got to remember is that secured assets don't vest with the trustee either. So, a house that's got a full mortgage on it, or a car that's brand new that you're making a vehicle payment, doesn't come to the trustee. So, I'm not trying to scare people off the top, but with a proposal, there's no vesting of assets, so nothing comes to the trustee. Mm-hmm. What you're doing is you're making a plan or a proposal, a lot of times a monthly payment to your creditors. They have the right to vote on it and make a decision. They can vote yay or nay, and that would be the biggest difference. The other difference is just the mark on your credit rating. A bankruptcy generally lands on your credit rating for 6 years from the date you finish it, whereas a proposal lands on your credit rating for 3 years from the date you finish it. Okay.
And credit rating, when you're in this situation, do you really have to stress about it that much or not?
I don't think you do. I think you got to look at it from a perspective what plan makes the most sense for you. So, you're when you're deciding as to whether or not a bankruptcy proposal makes sense, ultimately, you'll meet with a licensed insolvency trustee. They'll review your options, make a determination based on your circumstances in terms of what you have in front of you, what you have for assets, what you have for available income, what your debt load is, and then strive to make an offer to creditors, especially in a proposal. Generally, in a proposal, you're trying to yield a bigger return to your creditors than they would yield in a bankruptcy, because otherwise they're not going to vote in favor of it.
So is there a magic number when it comes to people you deal with? Is it $20,000, $80,000, $150,000 of debt?
Well, a consumer proposal, to qualify for a consumer proposal, you have to owe less than $250,000. Okay. Excluding your principal residence. Okay. So if your house is worth $400,000, for example, that does not work into the overall equation. So if your debt load is under the $250,000 threshold, then you qualify to do a consumer proposal. So generally it's unsecured debt, but the secured debt can work in that equation as well, because when you're talking about excluding your principal residence, if you had, a principal residence, and then you also, let's say you owned an apartment building, whether it's a successful apartment building or upside down in terms of the income coming in, and that's what's causing the stress. If that apartment building's on top of your unsecured debts throwing you over that $250,000 threshold, then you wouldn't qualify for a consumer proposal.
Right. So the reason I was bringing that up was if we were to say it's $100,000 in debt, and then you had to make the decision whether it's bankruptcy that you should do or a consumer proposal, this is where you obviously have, do you make the decision or does the person coming in to see you make the decision? Who ultimately gets to choose what's going to happen?
I think it's a decision that's made with our office or with myself personally. It's a decision that we make together. You know, what I would do is I look at your income, what you can afford to offer your creditors, and then ultimately you're looking when you're making your offer is to determine, okay, what kind of yield would your creditors receive if they ultimately voted your proposal down and they were looking at a bankruptcy? Well, if they're going to get, let's say, $10,000 in a bankruptcy, if you offer them a proposal of $9,000, they're not going to take it. So one factor we're looking at is to make sure that you're giving them a bigger return than they would receive if they voted you down and left you with no other option but to do a bankruptcy. And then the creditors never come back and say that they're looking for a certain dollar amount. But I mean, the more you can offer them, the more likely they are to vote in favor of it. So I don't often look necessarily at the full debt load. I look at what an individual can afford to do, right? Because there's no sense in offering a proposal that's going to leave you cash strapped every month and leave you in the same position that you're in when you come in the door, right? So it has to make sense from a cash flow for your family. And so again, it's ultimately up to the creditors to decide as to whether or not they're going to agree to your offer. But I think that you have to make that offer based on what's going to make your life comfortable.
I think this is one of the first times we've actually dove into this topic of really what can an individual expect with that initial consultation with a licensed insolvency trustee. What does that look like and how do you look at it? So I'm glad that you brought up these key points. So sometimes with the bankruptcy, let's say if it is $100,000 and the person may only get $10,000.
Yes, yeah.
Right. And then with a proposal, you can say, okay, we can maybe do $18,000. So then the debtor says, okay, yeah, let's go with the proposal.
Yeah. So what would happen is you'd come in, you do your assessment with the trustee, review the options. So the assessment would consist of, the trustee determining what you have for assets, what you've got for income, looking at, dependents, looking at your cash flow, whether you've got, childcare, expenses that are coming out of the household. And then you're looking at the debt threshold. And then you're kind of making the determination based on cash flow and what you can afford to do. So let's say in your example that you offered $18,000. So a consumer proposal can be stretched out over a 60-month period, 5 years. So what you're doing in that is you're saying, look, let's offer $300 a month for 60 months. And so you will make that offer to your creditors. So in a consumer proposal, the creditors receive the offer. They have 45 days to make a decision, yes or no. Right. So they ultimately will decide. And what you need is you need 51% of them to vote in favor of it to get it to pass. So again, what the creditors are often doing, they're comparing apples to oranges right off the get-go. They're looking, they're saying, okay, what are we getting if we force this individual, leave them with no other option but to do a bankruptcy if we vote this down? So what's our return going to be? Yes, we're getting more money than what we would get. They often look to say, okay, is the individual maximize the term of the proposal? So in our example, they're 60-month. So if you offer, a 24-month proposal, a lot of times your creditor is going to come back and say, if you can make a payment for 24 months, you can do it for 60. So they're looking for a maximum term. And then they're ultimately reviewing your cash flow to say, look, is there any more wiggle room here? Can we squeeze these individuals for any more money? And again, if you're covering your bare bones and your basis, a lot of times the creditors are going to look at it and say, this makes sense. Let's consider this. And so they vote in favor of the proposal, and then it's ratified by the court, and it's deemed to be a new contract. It's accepted. And then what you're required to do then is just make the payment on a month-to-month basis. There's no reporting of income on a month-to-month basis. You're making the payment, and then you're required to do 2 counseling sessions in your proposal throughout the term with the licensed insolvency trustee to make sure that budgetary issues are addressed and make sure that you're kind of aimed in the right direction in terms of what you're doing with your money, and make sure you understand, the risks of using credit in the future. And ultimately, the process is set up to protect, you as a debtor. So you're understanding what you're doing, and also to protect creditors that potentially may, lend money to you again at some point in the future.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's really interesting to know that's how they go about doing it. I also love the fact that you have to go through some counseling when it comes to your money, because I would assume that when you don't have the money to pay a debt, and you all of a sudden, life happens, right? We all know that life happens, and all of a sudden, a car breaks down or a fridge dies. You end up have to buy this thing, and all of a sudden, you can end up backwards again very quickly.
Yeah, it doesn't take long, right? So you got to get yourself into a new mind frame and establish, an emergency fund. And I find that, most debtors, the biggest adjustment, in a proposal or even in a bankruptcy is that they're liking the idea that they're on a plan, that they're kind of, getting rid of the debt. They're on the right course, but the biggest struggle for them is not having that line of credit or that credit card to fall back on in the event of an emergency, because they're used to it. They're used to it. If the car breaks down, look, okay, we'll just put it on the credit card this month, and then we'll deal with it. And then when you're in a proposal or bankruptcy, you don't have that access to that credit. So you have to recognize where you're spending your money, and you have to take the steps to establish an emergency fund, because we all need it.
Mm-hmm. And that's something we should all learn right from, grade 12 on.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't it be great if we all understood this? But
yeah,
it's so easy.
It is. Look, I always tell people the same story, is that I was in university and I got I was studying business, and I'd gotten a $500 credit card. And like every student, you use it a little bit, and you don't, if you don't have the cash to pay it. I can still remember my mother saying to me, she said, "Mark, have you made your credit card payment this month?" And I said, "No, I don't have any money. Can't do it." And she said, "You don't realize, the effect it will have on your credit." And so I rustled up the cash and I got it paid. And then it was that moment that, okay, because nobody reads the terms of their credit cards. No. Very few people understand, that you're required to make at least a minimum payment every month. They'll just use it because it's quick and easy and accessible, and then they'll attempt to try and pay it when they can afford to. But again, if you're making a payment 1 month and then missing 2 months worth of payments, your credit is going down, down, down.
But let's talk about one more positive point here, that once you come up with the bankruptcy plan or the proposal, something positive happens, and that is that the creditors stop calling.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. They'll stop calling the minute you file it, because the Stay of Proceedings restricts them from doing it. And you'll follow, if you ended up in a bankruptcy or ended up in a proposal, the phone calls stop. The action or the calls are directed towards the trustee until they have the information to make their assessment, and they're no longer calling you or touching base with you. So again, that takes the pressure off people, and taking that pressure off kind of gives you a chance to kind of assess and say, okay, what have we been doing? Mm-hmm. What can we do to save some money and kind of get aimed in the right direction?
And you've talked a lot about, families and how the families will budget. And this also helps families and relationships once you have that plan. And you've seen this in your office. Maybe you can give some examples of what people have said to you after they realize there is a plan and there is hope for them getting out of that debt.
Well, it's everybody's situation is different, but people will, there's always lots of positive feedback where people will say, "Look, I should have called you earlier." That's the bottom line. That's the number one thing you'll always hear you say. I should have called you earlier. I was afraid to pick up the phone. I was afraid to call. And again, my advice to everybody or anyone that's listening is that if you're struggling or you're having financial issues, don't be afraid to pick up the phone. You call a licensed insolvency trustee. They will give you some advice. You're not bound by anything. So picking up the phone and saying, "Look, here's what's going on. Can I have a chat with somebody?" Again, that you're not committed. You're not all of a sudden in bankruptcy. You're not all of a sudden in a proposal. You're getting some information. You're getting some advice, and then ultimately you can make a decision. And again, the more knowledge, the more power you have.
Yeah, absolutely perfect. Final words you want to share with us regarding this?
No, I would just say to people again, look, if you're struggling or you have any financial concerns, just touch base with a licensed insolvency trustee. Insolvency trustees are governed by the federal government through Industry Canada. We're licensed to provide financial advice. We're bound by the courts. We're an officer of the court. So we're not using sales tactics to get people through the door. We're there to help Canadians and provide them with advice to kind of get themselves out of the stress and from an insolvency position to a solvency position.
Yes. Terrific. Mark, we will chat again. I thank you very much for being on the show today.
Okay, thank you very much.
You got it. And to schedule a free consultation with Allan, Marshall & Associates, licensed insolvency trustees, you can go to their website, wecanhelp.ca. And that's it for today's Debt Matters podcast. Make sure you subscribe wherever you get your favorite podcast from. And of course, if you want some more information, you can always check out our website, debtmatters.ca. Thanks very much for listening.